On the eastern flank of the Great Pyramid, below the path the tour groups follow, there is a floor that almost no one stops to look at. It is black, the deep, even black of the stone itself, a hard volcanic rock called basalt, carried to this plateau more than 4,500 years ago and laid down as the paving of a temple whose walls are long gone. Kneel at the edge of it and run your hand across the surface, and you feel something the eye slides past. Parts of it are flat, and the flatness is the unsettling thing. Level enough that a film of water would lie across it in an even sheet without running to one side, the way it would on a machinist's bench. Basalt is one of the hardest stones the ancient world ever chose to work, and someone here cut and dressed and leveled acres of it. Everyone assumes the difficult decision was choosing to pave a temple in basalt at all. The difficult part was the cutting. How it was done, and with what, has never been answered cleanly. The copper these builders are supposed to have used was soft enough to mark with a fingernail. The basalt under your palm would round the edge off a copper blade in a single pass. And still the cuts are clean, the joints close, the surface true. Over the next 20 minutes, I want to walk you through what the stone itself still records, what the Egyptians drew of their own craftsmen at work, the one detail in those drawings that nearly everyone reads straight past, and the tool that did the cutting, which is not the tool you would expect. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Here is the version you have probably heard, and it deserves to be stated fairly before we start pulling at it. The standard account says the Egyptians shaped hard stone with copper tools, with saws and with hollow drills, helped along by stone hammers and an enormous amount of patient labor. Thousands of workers, generations of practice, simple metal and simpler muscle. On its face, that explanation is reasonable, and for much of the work it is almost certainly right. The trouble sits one layer down. In fact, the short version always leaves out. Copper, on its own, cannot cut basalt. It is too soft. Drag a copper edge across this floor as hard as you like, and the copper gives way, not the stone. So if the textbook is right that they used copper saws, then the copper was never the thing doing the cutting. Something else was. And the instant you ask what that something was, the simple story stops being simple, and the floor under your hand turns a good deal stranger than it looks. Start with where the stone even came from, because the scale of it is the first thing that should give you pause. The basalt of the Giza pavement was not local. It was quarried in the northern Fayum, at a place called Weden el Faras, in the hills above an ancient lake more than 50 miles to the south. From there it had to be moved, block after block of dense volcanic rock, each one heavy out of all proportion to its size, down to the water, across the lake, and up onto the plateau. That is before a single cut was made, and once it arrived, it was not dumped as rubble. It was sawn into slabs, dressed flat, and set as a continuous floor that originally covered an area you could not stroll across in under a minute. Pieces of that floor are still in place today. You can stand on them. The blocks meet along straight seams. The faces are worked. In places, the saw marks are still visible in the stone. Long parallel lines running across the cut surface where the blade once traveled. This is not a legend, or a lost object known only from a rumor. It is a real floor, in a real place, that a person can go and touch, made out of a stone that should have destroyed any copper tool that came near it. That contradiction is the anchor. Everything else hangs from it. Look closely at those saw marks and the first piece falls into place, though not in the way you might guess. More than a century ago, the English surveyor Flinders Petrie spent seasons at Giza measuring exactly this kind of evidence: the sawn blocks, the cut faces, the grooves left behind. He recorded slots in basalt and in granite that ran straight and true for a good length, wider than you would expect, and he understood at once that no simple hand tool of soft metal had done this on its own. The answer, worked out by Petrie and sharpened by the people who later sat down and reproduced the work, is stranger and simpler than any machine. The Egyptians did use a copper blade, but the blade never touched the stone the way a steel saw touches wood. Underneath it, fed into the cut, was loose grit, sand, the ordinary quartz sand that lies all over Egypt, and quartz is harder than basalt. The copper blade, pushed back and forth, did almost nothing but press that grit down and drag it along the line, and the grit, 1,000 tiny points each harder than the rock, scratched the basalt away a fraction at a time. The metal was a holder, the sand was the knife. That is the first answer to the question in the title: and it is cleverer than any lost engine, because it means the cutting edge was never solid at all. It was a moving river of stone dust, harder than the thing it was carving, and the copper was only there to carry it. Run that for long enough, with enough hands and enough patience, and you get a clean slot through the hardest stone in Egypt. The saws explain the flat cuts. The drills are where it stops being tidy. Among the things Petrie brought home from Egypt were cores, the solid plugs of stone left behind in the middle when a hollow tube is drilled down into a block, the same way a modern core drill leaves a cylinder behind. Some of these cores were granite and other hard stones, and around their sides ran a fine spiral groove, a single unbroken line winding down the core like the thread on a screw. Petrie measured those grooves and the depth they advanced per turn, and what he calculated unsettled him. The marks seemed to show the drill biting into the hardest stone faster, turn for turn, than he believed a sand abrasive could account for, so he reached for an explanation. He proposed that the drills must have carried fixed cutting points, hard jewels set into the metal, gouging the stone directly. It was an honest attempt to explain a real measurement, and I owe you the truth in return here, because this is exactly the kind of moment where this channel either keeps faith with you or loses it. Petrie's fixed point idea is not the accepted answer today. Most who have studied the cores since, and the people who have actually reproduced the work with copper tubes and wet sand, find that loose abrasive can in fact produce these cores and these grooves, given time. The spiral is read now as the track of grit dragged round and round under the turning tube, not the cut of a mounted gem. The orthodox toolkit holds, and yet the feed rates Petrie measured, and the precise way some of those grooves run, have never fully stopped being argued over. The reproductions work, they are also slow, and the fastest, cleanest examples in the ancient record still sit at the far edge of what the experiments comfortably reach. That gap, narrow but real, is the crack in the wall. It is not proof of anything. It is an honest, unanswered question, and it is the opening the bolder reading of all this has always used. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The Egyptians did not leave us a manual. What they left, in places, were pictures. On the walls of certain tombs, the kind built for the men who ran the royal workshops, there are scenes of craftsmen at their benches, and among them you can find the stoneworkers. In the tomb of a high official named Rekhmir, who oversaw the workshops in his day, there is a painted scene of men hollowing out stone vessels. The tool they hold is unmistakable once you know what you are looking at. It is a shaft with a forked, cranked top, weighted down by two heavy stones hung on either side, twisted back and forth by hand to bore down into the vessel below. That weighted twist drill is the ancestor of everything we have been talking about. The stones press the cutting end down into the work. The twisting drives the abrasive round. It is the same principle as the great saws and the tube drills, shrunk to the size of a jar. So far, the picture matches the theory. But look at what the scene shows, and what it quietly does not. It shows vessels being made, the everyday output of a working shop. It does not show the cutting of a basalt temple floor. It does not show the boring of the hardest granite. The Egyptians drew the ordinary version of the craft and left the extraordinary version undrawn, which is its own small mystery. We have the picture of the method. We do not have the picture of the method pushed to its limit, and it is at the limit that the questions live. Now go further back, before the pyramids, before the basalt floor, and the difficulty sharpens rather than fades. Long before the Great Pyramid rose, in the earliest centuries of Egyptian civilization, craftsmen were already turning out stone vessels by the thousand, and not in forgiving material. They made them in granite, in diorite, in basalt itself. Many survive, sitting today in museum cases, and a number of them are worked to a standard that is hard to fully account for. Some are bowls of near-perfect symmetry. Some are tall jars with a narrow neck at the top that opens into a wide hollow body beneath, the inside scooped out evenly, the walls brought down thin, through a mouth barely wide enough to admit more than a few fingers. The orthodox answer, again, is abrasive and a drill and patience, and again it carries most of the weight. The reproductions show you can hollow stone this way. What they strain to match is the symmetry of the very best of them, and the way the interior of a narrow-necked vase was worked so evenly when the hand doing the work could barely reach inside it. These are not famous objects. Most people have never heard of them. But they are real, they are early, and they sit there as a quiet, stubborn problem the simplest version of the story does not close. The deeper you go into the surviving work, the more often you meet that same feeling. The method we can prove explains most of it. The finest examples keep their distance. The pieces come together now, and I want to be plain that pulling them together means stepping off the solid ground, and I will tell you the moment I do. Everything proven points one way. The cutting was done by abrasive, by grit harder than the stone, carried by soft copper and by stone, and by the steady hand, dragged across basalt and granite under pressure and water until the rock surrendered. That is not a guess. It has been shown and reproduced. The reading this channel finds worth sitting with begins at the edge of that proof, in the narrow band where the finest and fastest of the ancient work still runs a little ahead of what the experiments can comfortably match. The likeliest answer is nothing more exotic than mastery, generations of refinement that made hands quicker and judgment finer than any modern person briefly reproducing the craft could ever hope to be. I want to be square with you that this probably is the answer. But the record does not slam the door on a second possibility, and it is the one the title points toward. It is the possibility that somewhere inside that mastery sat a specific refinement we have not put our hands on, a better abrasive than common sand, an emery or a crushed stone harder still, kept for the hardest cuts. A frame or a turning rig that held tool and stone to a truer line than a free hand could hold. A technique perfected in the workshops and guarded, handed down from one generation to the next as a closely held thing, and then, when the workshops finally fell silent, simply lost, leaving only the finished stone behind with no instructions attached to it. I cannot prove that to you. No one can, yet. But the stone that would carry the proof is still here, and it has not given up everything it knows. One thing matters more than any single claim in all of this, so I will say it plainly. This is a channel about the questions the ancient world has not fully closed. Some of what we have looked at tonight is solid and documented: the copper, the sand, the drills, the floor you can go and stand on. Some of it is theory, the lost refinement, the tool not yet found, and where it is theory I have told you so as we went. The aim was never to hand you a verdict. It was to show you what is there, in the stone, and let you decide for yourself what it means. And what is there comes down to a single overturned assumption. We picture a tool as a hard edge biting a softer thing, so we assume the Egyptians must have had some harder metal, some secret blade, to get through basalt. We go looking for it, and we never find it, because it was never there. The tool they used was not an edge at all, it was grit. Loose, granular, unremarkable in the hand, a fistful of sand that happened to be harder than a stone most people think of as unbreakable. That fistful of sand, pressed and dragged for hour upon patient hour, is what shaped the hardest monuments the ancient world produced. That much is the answer, and it is a better one than any lost machine, because it is true, and because it is theirs. The open part, the part this channel will keep coming back to, is only how far that simple and brilliant method was carried, and whether at its very limit it was sharpened by something we have not yet recovered. The sand we understand. The full reach of what they did with it, we do not. The basalt floor on the east side of the Great Pyramid is still there. It is still black, still hard, still flat enough in places to hold a sheet of water without spilling it. The saw marks still run across the cut faces. The cores Petrie measured are still wound with their fine spiral grooves, and the argument over how quickly that spiral was cut has never entirely ended. The narrow-necked vases still sit in their cases with their even, unreachable interiors, made before the pyramids by people using tools we believe we understand, to a standard we cannot always match. None of that is a cover-up, and none of it is a hoax. It is something better and harder to live with. A real method that explains almost everything, and a thin margin at the top of the work where almost is not quite all. The Egyptians cut the hardest stone on earth with sand and water and patience, and a kind of skill the world has not seen since. Whether that skill stopped at the edge of what we have managed to reproduce, or reached a little further than we have been able to follow, is a door still standing open in the stone. Go and stand on that floor one day, and lay your hand flat against it, and you will feel the question for yourself. There is one place the argument tends to go that I have deliberately held back, because it deserves its own moment rather than being folded into what came before. When we talk about the abrasive method, We usually imagine it as a slow accumulation of small acts. A blade pushed, grit dragged, a groove deepening by fractions of a millimeter per hour. And that is almost certainly how most of the work was done. But there is a question no one asks loudly enough, and it is this. Who decided? Not who held the tool. Who decided where the cut went? The finished floor is not just flat. It is level across a span that required someone to know, before the first block was dressed, what level meant across that distance. The joints are not just close, they are consistent, which means the men fitting them were working to a shared standard that had to exist before the stone arrived. The vessels are not just symmetrical, they are symmetrical in the same way across centuries, which means the knowledge of how to produce that symmetry was held and passed on intact across generations of craftsmen who left no written record of having done so. The tool we can describe. The transmission of the knowledge behind the tool is the thing that has vanished most completely. Every craft tradition in history that produced work at this level carried alongside it a body of practical knowledge that was never written down, because the people who held it did not need to write it. It lived in the hand, it lived in the judgment of when the sound of the drill changed, when the feel of the grit under the blade told a practiced palm that the cut was running true. That knowledge is not in the stone, it is the one thing the stone could not preserve. And it is, in the end, the only tool that ever mattered. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.